The musty smell of my father's old farmhouse hit me the moment I stepped through the front door. A mixture of lavender cleaning spray and the faint medicinal scent that seemed to cling to everything since Dad turned 82. I'd driven the 40-minute route from town with a container of his favorite beef stew, the same Thursday tradition we'd maintained for 3 years since Mom passed. But today felt different. Dad's usual warm greeting was replaced by a cold stare from his recliner, his weathered hands gripping the armrests like he was bracing himself. "Dad, I brought your favorite stew," I called out, forcing brightness into my voice as I headed toward the kitchen. The floorboards creaked under my feet, each step echoing through the unnaturally quiet house. "I don't want anything from you, Rebecca," he said, his voice carrying a bitter edge I'd never heard before. "Not after what Marcus told me about your real intentions." What I'm about to tell you is absolutely true and will leave you speechless. Please like and subscribe. Tell me which city you call home. My name is Rebecca Powell. I'm 45 years old, and those words from my father's mouth felt like ice water in my veins. Marcus, my younger brother, Marcus Powell, who hadn't visited Dad more than twice in the past year, had somehow poisoned my father's mind against me. The container of stew trembled in my hands as I set it down on the kitchen counter, my mind racing to understand what could have happened. "Dad, what exactly did Marcus tell you?" I asked, walking back into the living room where afternoon sunlight filtered through the faded curtains, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. His blue eyes, still sharp despite his age, fixed on me with suspicion. "He told me you've been asking about my bank accounts, my will, trying to figure out how much money I have. Said you're planning to put me in a home so you can get your hands on everything." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. I sank into Mom's old chair across from him, the familiar floral print suddenly feeling foreign and unwelcoming. "Dad, that's not true. I've never asked about your money. I help with your groceries and your medicine because I love you, not because I want anything from you." But even as I spoke, I could see the doubt in his eyes, the way he'd pulled back from me emotionally. Marcus had somehow convinced our father that my 3 years of Thursday dinners, weekend check-ins, and grocery runs were all part of some elaborate scheme. The betrayal cut deeper than any argument Marcus and I had ever had as children. Later that evening, I sat at my kitchen table across from my daughter Sarah Powell, who'd driven over after I called her in tears. At 23, Sarah had inherited my stubborn streak and her grandfather's sharp intuition. She listened as I recounted the afternoon, her dark eyes growing angrier with each detail. "Uncle Marcus has barely spoken to Grandpa since Grandma died," Sarah said, her voice tight with indignation. "And now he's suddenly concerned about Grandpa's finances? That doesn't add up, Mom." The next morning, I called my longtime friend and former co-worker Janet Martinez, who'd known our family for over 15 years. Janet had a way of seeing through people's motives that had served her well during her years as a social worker. When I explained the situation, her response was immediate and sharp. "Rebecca, this smells like projection to me," Janet said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd dealt with family manipulation countless times. "In my experience, when someone accuses another person of financial motives out of nowhere, they're usually the ones with those motives." That afternoon, I decided to drive back to Dad's house, hoping to have a calmer conversation. But as I pulled into the gravel driveway, I noticed Marcus's red pickup truck parked under the old oak tree. Through the living room window, I could see him leaning close to Dad, gesturing emphatically while Dad nodded along. The scene made my stomach turn. My brother, who'd spent years avoiding family responsibilities, now playing the role of concerned son. I sat in my car for several minutes, watching them through the window. Marcus was animated, pointing toward the kitchen where I'd left countless meals, toward the hallway where I'd helped Dad organize his medications, toward the pile of mail I'd been helping him sort through each week. Every gesture seemed calculated to reinforce whatever narrative he'd constructed about my supposed greed. When I finally knocked on the door, the conversation inside stopped abruptly. Marcus answered, his face flushed with what looked like guilt mixed with defiance. At 39, he still carried himself with the cocky attitude that had gotten him into trouble throughout his teens and 20s. "Rebecca," he said, not moving from the doorway. "Dad's resting right now. Maybe you should come back another time." "This is my regular day to visit," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've been coming every Thursday for 3 years, Marcus. Dad expects me." Behind him, I could hear Dad's voice. "Let her in, Marcus. We need to settle this." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut as I entered. Dad remained in his chair, but his posture was different, more rigid, more guarded. Marcus positioned himself near the fireplace like he was standing guard, his arms crossed over his chest. Suddenly, the pieces aligned. "Dad," I said softly, settling into the chair across from him. "What exactly has Marcus told you?" Dad's weathered hands fidgeted with the remote control in his lap. For a moment, the man who'd raised me with such confidence and authority looked smaller, uncertain. "He's concerned about the frequency of your visits, Rebecca. Says you've been asking too many questions about my accounts, my will." "What questions?" I asked, genuinely confused. "Dad, you asked me to help you organize your bills. You gave me your checkbook because you said the numbers were getting hard to read." Marcus stepped forward from his position by the fireplace. "See? Right there. You just admitted you have access to his finances?" The accusation hit me like a slap. "I balance his checkbook once a month because he asked me to. I've never written a check without his permission or taken a single dollar for myself." "But you could," Marcus pressed, his voice taking on a tone I remembered from our childhood arguments. "You have all the access you need." Dad looked between us, confusion creeping into his expression. This was exactly what I'd feared. Marcus creating doubt where none should exist. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to my photos. "Dad, look at this," I said, showing him a picture I'd taken the previous month. "Remember when we organized your filing cabinet? You specifically asked me to help you understand those investment statements because the print was too small." Dad's face softened as he looked at the image of us sitting at his kitchen table, papers spread out between us, both of us smiling. "Yes, I remember that day." "You explained everything so patiently." "And this one," I continued, swiping to another photo. "Last Christmas, when you asked me to help you write checks for the grandchildren's gifts because your arthritis was bothering you?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "Photos don't prove anything about your motives." "What motives, Marcus?" I turned to face him fully. In 3 years of helping Dad, what have I gained? I spend my Thursdays here instead of running errands or relaxing after work. I've used my own gas money to drive back and forth when he needed groceries or doctor visits. I've never asked for reimbursement, never suggested he pay me for my time. "Maybe you're playing the long game," Marcus said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. Dad's eyes sharpened, and for a moment I saw a flash of the sharp businessman he'd once been. "Marcus, sit down." My brother reluctantly took a seat on the sofa, his defensive posture unchanged. "In the past month, you visited me more than in the previous 2 years combined," Dad continued, his voice growing stronger. "Yesterday, you were asking about my insurance policies, my retirement accounts. Today you want to know about Rebecca's involvement in my finances. Why the sudden interest?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus's face flushed deeper red, and he shifted uncomfortably. I'm worried about you, Dad. I don't want anyone taking advantage. But you weren't worried when Rebecca was driving me to physical therapy after my knee surgery, Dad said slowly, as if pieces were falling into place. You weren't worried when she spent her weekend helping me clean out the basement, or when she organized all my medications so I wouldn't miss doses. I watched this exchange with growing hope. Dad was remembering, seeing through the confusion Marcus had tried to create. That's different, Marcus mumbled. How is it different? I asked quietly. Marcus stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Look, maybe I was wrong, okay? Maybe I misunderstood the situation. But Dad wasn't finished. Son, I need you to be honest with me. Have you gotten yourself into some kind of financial trouble? The question struck home. Marcus's shoulders sagged, and the cockiness that had carried him into this confrontation seemed to drain away. He stood with his back to us, staring out at the yard where we'd played as children. I lost my job 6 weeks ago, he said finally, his voice barely audible. The construction company downsized. I've been looking, but nothing's come through yet. Sarah doesn't know how bad it is. The admission changed everything in the room. Dad's expression shifted from suspicion to concern, and despite everything Marcus had put me through over the past 2 days, I felt a pang of sympathy for my brother. Why didn't you tell us? I asked. Marcus turned back to face us, and I saw something I hadn't seen since we were children. Genuine vulnerability. Because I'm 39 years old, and I shouldn't need to run to Daddy every time I mess up. I thought I could handle it myself. So you thought you'd handle it by trying to convince Dad that I was stealing from him? The words came out harsher than I intended, but the hurt was still raw. I panicked, okay? Marcus's voice cracked slightly. I kept thinking about how you're here all the time, how close you are to Dad, how much he trusts you. And I thought maybe if he didn't trust you so much, he might turn to you instead. Dad finished quietly. Might ask you for help. Marcus nodded miserably. I know how awful that sounds. I know what I did was wrong. But I'm behind on my mortgage, Rebecca. 2 months behind. And Sarah thinks I'm still working. The room fell silent except for the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. This was my brother, the same person who'd taught me to ride a bike, who'd defended me against bullies in middle school, who'd been my partner in countless childhood adventures. Somewhere along the way, pride and desperation had turned him into someone I barely recognized. But as I looked at him now, seeing past the anger and manipulation to the fear underneath, I realized this wasn't just about money. This was about a family that had somehow lost its way, where asking for help felt impossible, and mistrust had taken root where love should have flourished. Dad cleared his throat, drawing both our attention. Marcus, come sit back down. We need to figure this out together. As my brother reluctantly returned to the sofa, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In his back pocket, partially visible, was the corner of what looked like a legal document. And if my eyes weren't deceiving me, I could just make out part of a letterhead that looked remarkably similar to Dad's attorney's office stationery. Whatever Marcus had been planning, his confession about the job might not have been the whole truth. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stared at that corner of paper protruding from Marcus's pocket. The familiar cream-colored letterhead of Hensley and Associates made my mouth go dry. Dad had used that law firm for 23 years, ever since Mom died, and he'd needed to update his will. Rebecca, you look like you've seen a ghost, Dad said. his weathered hands folding in his lap as he settled deeper into his recliner. The afternoon light streaming through the bay window caught the silver in his hair, making him look every one of his 74 years. I forced my gaze away from Marcus's back pocket and tried to keep my voice steady. I'm just processing everything. The lie tasted bitter on my tongue, but I needed time to think. If Marcus had somehow gotten hold of legal documents, or worse, if he'd been to see Dad's attorney without telling us. Marcus perched on the edge of the sofa cushion, his shoulders hunched forward like he was preparing to bolt. The living room felt smaller somehow, the familiar comfort of Dad's old furniture and Mom's carefully chosen wallpaper now seeming to press in on us. The scent of Dad's morning coffee still lingered in the air, mixing with the faint smell of the cherry wood polish I'd used on the end tables just yesterday. Son, look at me, Dad said quietly. There was something in his tone that made both Marcus and me turn toward him. Dad's blue eyes, still sharp despite his age, held a sadness that went deeper than disappointment. I need you to be completely honest with me now. Is losing your job really the whole story? The grandfather clock in the corner seemed to tick louder in the silence that followed. Marcus's hands clenched and unclenched in his lap, and I watched a muscle jump in his jaw. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I've made some mistakes, Dad. Big ones. The admission hung in the air like smoke. I felt Sarah's phantom presence in the room, imagining how devastated she'd be to know that her husband was keeping secrets not just from her, but from all of us. The weight of family loyalty pressed down on my chest, warring with the growing certainty that Marcus was still hiding something crucial. What kind of mistakes? I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. Marcus shifted on the sofa, and the paper in his pocket crinkled softly. The sound might as well have been thunder for how it made me flinch. There were some investments, some opportunities that seemed too good to pass up. Sarah's been wanting to redo the kitchen for years, and with Emma starting high school next year, we wanted to make sure we could afford. He trailed off, shaking his head. It doesn't matter what the reasons were. I made bad decisions. Dad leaned forward in his chair, the old leather creaking under his weight. How bad, Marcus? Bad enough that losing my job wasn't the beginning of our problems. It just made everything impossible to hide anymore. Marcus's voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment, he looked exactly like he had at 8 years old when he'd accidentally broken Mom's favorite vase and had to confess. But that paper in his pocket kept nagging at me. I'd spent enough time helping Dad organize his affairs to recognize legal documents, and something about the way Marcus kept shifting, as if he was conscious of its presence, set off every alarm bell in my head. Marcus, I said carefully, when was the last time you spoke to Mr. Hensley? The question hit him like a physical blow. All the color drained from his face, and his eyes darted between Dad and me with a panicked expression that confirmed my worst fears. I don't. Why would you ask that? He stammered. Because I can see the corner of what looks like legal papers sticking out of your back pocket, and they have a letterhead that looks remarkably similar to Dad's attorney's office. My voice was steadier than I felt, but inside, my stomach was churning with a mixture of anger and dread. Dad's expression darkened, the concern in his eyes hardening into something more dangerous. Marcus Edward, you take those papers out right now and put them on this coffee table. The use of Marcus's full name transported us both back to childhood, when that tone meant someone was in serious trouble. Marcus's hand moved instinctively toward his pocket, then froze. Dad, I can explain. The papers, Marcus. Now. The room felt charged with electricity as Marcus slowly reached behind him and withdrew a small stack of folded documents. His hands shook as he placed them on the coffee table, the cream-colored letterhead now clearly visible. Even from my position across the room, I could see Dad's name printed at the top of the first page. "What exactly did you think you were going to accomplish?" Dad's voice was quiet, but there was a steel underneath that I'd rarely heard from him. "Were you planning to forge my signature? Convince me to sign something I hadn't read? Or had you already taken care of that part yourself?" The accusation hung in the air like a blade, and I watched my brother crumble under the weight of it. Marcus looked like he was going to be sick. His hands clasped and unclasped in his lap as he stared at the papers on the coffee table, as if they might spontaneously combust and save him from this moment. "I wasn't going to forge anything," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I went to see Mr. Hensley to ask about options, about what would happen if Dad needed more care, or if something happened to him." "And you did this without talking to me first," Dad said, his tone still dangerously calm. "Without talking to your sister, who has been handling my affairs for the past 2 years." The weight of that statement settled over me like a heavy blanket. 2 years. Had it really been that long since I'd gradually taken over managing Dad's medications, his doctor appointments, his finances? It hadn't felt like a burden at the time, just a natural progression as he'd started forgetting things more often, getting confused by insurance paperwork and prescription changes. But looking at Marcus now, I realized he might have seen it differently. While I was stepping in to help, was he feeling pushed out? Was that why he'd been so quick to suggest I had ulterior motives? "Marcus," I said, trying to keep my voice gentler than Dad's, "what exactly did Mr. Hensley tell you?" He finally looked up at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my chest tighten. Desperation, yes, but also a deep, aching sadness that went beyond his current financial troubles. He said that if Dad was declared incompetent, or if he needed full-time care, that his power of attorney would need to make decisions about his assets. Marcus's words came out in a rush, as if he was forcing himself to get them out before he lost his nerve. "And since Sarah has the power of attorney, she would have complete control over everything." "So you thought what, exactly?" I couldn't keep the hurt out of my voice now. "That I was waiting for Dad to get worse so I could steal from him?" "No!" Marcus's response was immediate and fierce, but then his shoulders sagged. "I don't know. Maybe? Sarah, you don't understand what it's like to watch everything you've worked for just disappear. To know that your kids might not have a home next month, that your wife is working double shifts just to keep the lights on." I felt Dad shift beside me, his anger tempered now by something that looked like understanding. But I wasn't there yet. The betrayal was still too fresh, too raw. "So your solution was to convince Dad that I'm the problem? To make him doubt the one person who's been helping him navigate all of this?" "I wasn't trying to turn him against you permanently," Marcus said, and for the first time since this conversation started, he sounded more like my brother and less like a stranger. "I just thought, if you weren't the power of attorney anymore, if Dad gave me some authority over his finances, maybe I could find a way to help my family without actually taking anything that wasn't rightfully—" He stopped mid-sentence, probably realizing how that sounded. "Rightfully what, son?" Dad's voice was quiet now, but there was something in it that made both Marcus and me look at him more carefully. "I know what you're thinking," Dad continued. "I've been thinking it too, watching both of you these past few years. Marcus, You're thinking about what you might inherit someday, and whether that could solve your immediate problems. And Sarah, you're thinking about what it means that your brother sees Dad's money as a solution to his troubles. The accuracy of his observation hit me like a physical blow, because he was right. I had been thinking exactly that. Every time Marcus had made one of his comments about Dad's spending, every time he'd questioned a decision I'd made on Dad's behalf, I'd wondered if he was calculating his inheritance, if he saw Dad as a bank account rather than a person. But sitting here now, looking at my brother's devastated expression, I realized the situation was more complicated than I'd wanted to acknowledge. Marcus wasn't some cold-hearted opportunist. He was a desperate man who'd made terrible decisions and was now grasping at straws to save his family. That didn't excuse what he'd done, but it helped explain it. "What do those papers say exactly?" I asked, nodding toward the documents on the coffee table. Marcus glanced at Dad, who nodded grimly. "Go ahead, tell her." They're draft documents that would give me co-power of attorney with Sarah," Marcus said, his voice getting smaller with each word. "And they include provisions for me to access Dad's savings account for family emergencies." The room went completely silent. I could hear the old grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Family emergencies," I repeated slowly. "Like your mortgage payments? Your credit card debt?" Marcus flinched, but he nodded. "And you were planning to present these to Dad when, exactly? After you'd convinced him that I couldn't be trusted?" "I don't know," Marcus said, and his voice broke on the words. "I don't know what I was planning, Sarah. I just know that 3 weeks ago, Jennifer was crying in our kitchen because she didn't know how to tell the kids we might have to move, and I felt like such a complete failure as a husband and father that I couldn't think straight. Jennifer. I'd met Marcus's wife only a handful of times over the years, but she'd always seemed like a kind, practical woman. The image of her crying over their kitchen table, worried about their children, made something twist painfully in my chest. "Why didn't you just ask us for help?" The question came out more plaintively than I'd intended. "Why didn't you come to Dad and me and explain what was happening? We're your family, Marcus. We would have tried to figure something out." "Would you?" Marcus looked up at me with an expression so raw and vulnerable that it reminded me powerfully of the little boy he'd once been. "Because for the past 2 years, every time I've tried to be involved in Dad's care or his finances, you've made it clear that you have it handled. Every time I've asked questions or made suggestions, you've acted like I was interfering." His words hit their mark because there was truth in them. I had been protective of my role as Dad's primary caregiver. When Marcus questioned my decisions, I'd bristled. When he'd suggested alternative approaches, I'd dismissed them. I'd told myself I was protecting Dad from stress and confusion, but maybe I'd also been protecting my own sense of usefulness, my own feeling of being needed and competent. "That doesn't justify what you did," I said, but there was less anger in my voice now and more sadness. "No," Marcus agreed. "It doesn't. I know that. I've known it from the moment I started down this path, but I felt trapped. And then Mr. Hensley mentioned that sometimes family members misuse their power of attorney, and it was like he was giving me permission to think that maybe you—" "Maybe I what? Maybe I was stealing from our father?" Marcus winced. "Maybe you were making decisions based on what would be best for you instead of what would be best for Dad." The accusation stung because it forced me to examine my own motivations. Had I been making decisions based on what was best for Dad? Or had some of my choices been influenced by a desire to maintain control, to be the good daughter, to ensure my own future security? I thought about the conversations I'd had with Dad's doctors, the decisions I'd made about his medications, and his care. I thought about the financial choices I'd guided him toward, the way I'd organized his accounts and his investments. Had I been acting in his best interests, or had I been unconsciously serving my own? "Sarah," Dad said quietly, and I realized I'd been silent for several long moments, lost in uncomfortable self-reflection. "I think we need to have a different kind of conversation." Something in his tone made both Marcus and me look at him with new attention. There was a gravity there that hadn't been present before, a weight that suggested he was about to say something that would change the entire dynamic of this situation. "There's something I haven't told either of you," Dad continued, his eyes moving between Marcus and me. "Something Mr. Hensley and I discussed 3 months ago, long before Marcus came to see him." My heart began to beat faster. 3 months ago? What had Dad been planning that he hadn't shared with me? "I've been thinking about going into assisted living." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Assisted living. Dad had been thinking about assisted living for months, and he hadn't told me. "What?" I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. Marcus looked as stunned as I felt. "Dad, you never said anything about that to me either." "I know," Dad said, settling back in his chair with the careful movements that had become more pronounced over the past year. "I wasn't ready to talk about it with either of you. I needed to think it through on my own first to understand what it would mean." I felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. Everything I thought I knew about Dad's situation, about my role in his life, about why I'd been so protective of the decisions I was making for him, suddenly seemed different. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, and I could hear the hurt in my own voice. "We talk about everything." I thought we talked about everything. Dad's expression softened. "Because I knew you'd try to talk me out of it, and because I wasn't sure I could explain it in a way that wouldn't hurt your feelings." "What do you mean?" He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Sarah, you've been wonderful. More than wonderful. You've rearranged your entire life to take care of me, and I see how hard you work to make sure I'm safe and comfortable, and that all my needs are met." I nodded, waiting for the but that I could sense coming. "But I also see how much it's costing you. Not money, time, energy, your own life. You're 43 years old, and instead of building your career or dating or traveling or doing whatever it is you want to do, you're here every day making sure I take my pills and get to my appointments and don't fall down in the shower." "That's what I want to be doing," I protested. "Dad, taking care of you isn't a burden. You took care of me for 18 years. This is just my turn." "Is it really what you want?" Dad asked gently. "Or is it what you think you should want?" The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to answer, then closed it again. Was taking care of Dad what I wanted to do? Or had it become such a central part of my identity over the past 2 years that I couldn't imagine any other way of being? "And there's another thing," Dad continued. "I'm lonely." That hit me like a physical blow. "Lonely? But I'm here almost every day. We have dinner together 3 times a week. We watch movies together. We go to your appointments together." "I know, sweetheart, and I treasure that time. But the rest of the time, I'm here by myself. I don't have friends dropping by anymore because most of them are dealing with their own health problems, or they've moved to be closer to their children. I don't have neighbors I really know because this neighborhood has changed so much over the years. Most of my day is spent alone, waiting for you to call or come over." Marcus leaned forward. "Dad, I had no idea. Why didn't you say something?" What was I going to say? That your sister was doing everything possible to take care of me, but I still felt isolated and sad most of the time? How do you tell someone who's sacrificing so much for you that it's still not enough to fill the hole where a whole life used to be? I felt tears starting to build behind my eyes. All this time, I'd thought I was giving Dad everything he needed. I'd been so focused on managing his medical care and his finances and his physical safety that I'd missed something much more fundamental. I'd missed his emotional needs, his social needs, his need to feel connected to a community. So you talked to Mr. Hensley about assisted living options, I said slowly. I did. We looked at several places, just to get information. There's one about 15 minutes from here that has a really good program. They have activities and social events, and there are people there all the time. Other residents, staff, visitors. It feels alive in a way this house hasn't felt since your mother died. I tried to imagine Dad in an assisted living facility. I tried to imagine not being the person responsible for every aspect of his care. Part of me felt relieved at the thought, which made me feel guilty. Part of me felt scared, which confused me. Is this what you want? I asked. Really? I think it might be, Dad said. But I also know it would be a big change for you, Sarah. Being my caregiver has become such a big part of your life. I worried about what you would do if you didn't have me to take care of. His words stung because they were true. What would I do if I wasn't organizing Dad's medications and driving him to appointments and making sure he was eating properly? What would my days look like? What would my purpose be? This is why you've been worried about the finances, Marcus said, understanding dawning in his voice. You weren't just thinking about general future care. You were researching specific costs for specific places. Dad nodded. The place I'm interested in costs about $4,000 a month. With my Social Security and the pension, I can cover about half of that. The rest would have to come from savings and investments. I felt the pieces clicking into place. So when Marcus started questioning my decisions about your money, you got scared that maybe there wouldn't be enough to make this work. Exactly. And when he started talking about financial abuse and suggesting that maybe your decisions weren't sound, I began to worry that maybe I'd been wrong to trust my judgment about the assisted living facility. Maybe I'd been wrong to keep it from both of you. Maybe I was making a mistake that would leave me stuck in a situation I couldn't get out of. Marcus looked stricken. Dad, I'm so sorry. I had no idea you were dealing with all of this. If I had known you were trying to make plans for your future, instead of whatever I thought was happening with the money. You thought Sarah was stealing from me, Dad said, matter-of-factly. I thought something wasn't right, Marcus said. But I was wrong about what it was, and I was wrong about how I handled it. We sat in silence for several minutes, each of us processing what Dad had revealed. I was trying to reconcile the image I had of myself as a good daughter taking care of her father with the reality Dad was describing, a reality where my care wasn't enough and maybe wasn't even what he needed most. There's something else, Dad said finally, and I braced myself for another revelation that would reshape my understanding of our situation. There's something else, Dad said finally, and I braced myself for another revelation that would reshape my understanding of our situation. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I've been having some memory issues. Small things mostly, but they're getting more frequent. My heart sank. I'd noticed a few instances where Dad seemed confused or forgot things he'd just told me, but I'd attributed it to normal aging and the stress of managing his various health conditions. What kind of memory issues? Marcus asked gently. I'll start a conversation and forget what we were talking about halfway through. Sometimes I can't remember if I've taken my medication. Last week, I got confused about which day it was and missed a doctor's appointment. Dad's voice was steady, but I could see the fear in his eyes. That's another reason I've been looking at assisted living facilities. The one I'm interested in has different levels of care. If my memory gets worse, I could transition to their memory care unit without having to move to a completely different place. I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. Not only was Dad planning to move out and no longer need my daily care, but he was dealing with cognitive changes that I'd either missed or minimized. What kind of caregiver did that make me? Dad, why didn't you tell me about the memory problems? I asked, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. Because I knew you'd worry, and because I was afraid you might try to take over more than you already have. He looked at me with such gentleness that it made my chest ache. Sarah, you've been wonderful to me, but I need to make decisions about my future while I still can, before the decisions get made for me. Marcus cleared his throat. Is this why you've been making changes to your investments? Moving money around to make sure you can afford the assisted living? Partly, yes. I wanted to make sure the money was positioned in a way that would give me the most flexibility. Sarah helped me understand the different options, and we moved some things around to maximize the monthly income I could generate. I watched Marcus absorb this information, seeing him reconstruct his understanding of the financial moves he'd been so suspicious about. The guilt on his face was painful to watch. I jumped to all the wrong conclusions, Marcus said quietly. I saw the account changes, and Dad seeming confused sometimes, and I assumed the worst about Sarah instead of considering that there might be legitimate reasons for everything. The confusion you noticed, Dad said to Marcus, that was the memory issues. But instead of talking to either of us about what you were observing, you decided Sarah must be taking advantage of it. The room fell silent again. I could feel years of family dynamics playing out in that silence. Marcus had always been the protective one, the one who swooped in during crises but wasn't around for the day-to-day reality. I'd been the steady presence, the one who handled the mundane responsibilities of Dad's care. But somewhere along the way, those roles had become problematic for all of us. I think, Dad said slowly, that we all need to talk about how we want to handle things going forward. My memory issues aren't severe yet, but they're progressing. The assisted living facility would give me support with daily tasks and medication management, but it would also mean big changes for all of us. I realized I'd been holding my breath. What kind of changes? Well, for you, Sarah, it would mean stepping back from being my primary caregiver. I know that might be harder than it sounds. Taking care of me has become your job in a way. If I moved to assisted living, what would you do with all that time and energy? The question hit me like a physical blow, not because it was cruel, but because it was so perceptive. I'd organized my entire life around Dad's needs, my social connections, my daily routine, my sense of purpose. All of it revolved around his care. The idea of him not needing me felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying. And for you, Marcus, Dad continued, it would mean accepting that I'm capable of making these kinds of decisions, even with my memory issues. It would mean trusting that Sarah and I can work together to manage my care and my finances without your oversight. Marcus nodded slowly. I can do that. I should have been doing that all along. There's more we need to discuss about the timeline and the practical details, Dad said. But first, I need to know something, Sarah. How do you feel about me moving to assisted living? Really feel, not what you think you should say. I took a deep breath, trying to sort through the tangle of emotions in my chest. Relief? Sadness, fear, guilt, and something else I was afraid to name. Freedom, maybe. I'm scared, I admitted, but not just for you. I'm scared about what comes next for me. The admission hung in the air like morning fog, thick and revealing. Dad's eyes softened with understanding, while Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly unprepared for this level of emotional honesty. The living room, with its familiar worn furniture and the afternoon light filtering through curtains I'd washed just last week, suddenly felt like a confessional. Tell me about that fear, Dad said gently, settling back into his recliner. His hands, spotted with age but still steady when his mind was clear like now, folded carefully in his lap. What does what comes next look like to you? I glanced around the room that had become the center of my universe. The pill organizer on the side table that I filled every Sunday. The notebook where I tracked his doctor appointments and medication changes. The special cushion I'd bought for his chair to help with his back pain. Every object told the story of how thoroughly I'd woven myself into his daily existence. I don't know who I am if I'm not taking care of you, I said, the words coming out smaller than I'd intended. For the past 3 years, everything I do has been about making sure you're okay. I wake up thinking about whether you remembered to take your morning pills. I go to bed wondering if you'll be confused when you wake up. I plan my days around your needs, my weekends around your appointments. Marcus leaned forward, and I could see him processing this reality he'd never fully grasped. But Sarah, before Dad needed help, you had your own life. Your job at the library, your book club, that pottery class you were always talking about. I quit the book club 2 years ago because the meetings ran late and I was worried about leaving Dad alone in the evenings, I said. I gave up pottery because the class was on Wednesdays, the same day as his physical therapy. And the library? I trailed off, thinking about how I'd gradually shifted from full-time to part-time to essentially being on call, always ready to leave if Dad needed something. The weight of these accumulated sacrifices settled over the room. Dad's expression had grown increasingly troubled as I spoke, and I could see him connecting dots he hadn't fully recognized before. Oh, sweetheart, he said softly. I didn't realize how much you'd given up. I wanted to give it up, I said quickly, because that was true too. When you needed help, it felt natural to step in. It felt right. But somewhere along the way, I stopped having anything that was just mine. Marcus rubbed his forehead, looking genuinely stricken. And here I was, convinced you were somehow benefiting from Dad's situation. God, Sarah, I'm so sorry. I couldn't see past my own assumptions to understand what you were actually going through. The afternoon light had shifted, casting longer shadows across the carpet. In this gentler illumination, Marcus looked more like the big brother I remembered from childhood, the one who'd taught me to ride a bike and defended me from neighborhood bullies, rather than the suspicious adversary he'd become in recent months. The irony, I continued, finding momentum in this unexpected honesty, is that you accused me of trying to control Dad's money, but I've been so focused on his day-to-day care that I barely thought about the financial side until you brought it up. The assisted living research started because I was worried about his safety, not because I was planning anything with his assets. Dad nodded slowly. Which brings us back to the question of timing. Sarah, if you're going to rebuild parts of your life that you've set aside, that takes time and energy. If I'm going to adjust to a new living situation, that's easier when I'm still mentally flexible enough to adapt to change. You mean sooner rather than later? I said, understanding the subtext. I mean, we don't have to wait until there's a crisis to make changes that might benefit everyone involved, Dad replied. But I also mean that whatever we decide, We decide together. No more Marcus getting secondhand information and drawing his own conclusions. No more me pretending I don't need help when I do. And no more you sacrificing pieces of yourself without us even acknowledging what you're giving up. Marcus stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the small front yard he'd helped Dad plant 5 years ago. The rose bushes were overgrown now, another small maintenance task that had slipped through the cracks of our changed family dynamics. I have a confession too, Marcus said without turning around. Part of why I was so suspicious wasn't just about protecting Dad. I felt guilty about not being more involved in his care, and it was easier to imagine that you had ulterior motives than to admit that I'd left you to handle everything alone. The honesty in the room was becoming almost overwhelming, like we'd opened windows that had been sealed shut for years. I could feel the family relationships that had grown strained and complicated beginning to shift into new configurations. So what do we do with all this? I asked. Where do we go from here? Dad was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the arm of his chair in the rhythm that meant he was thinking through something complex. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a decisiveness I hadn't heard in months. I think we start by visiting some of those assisted living places together, all 3 of us. Not as me being forced into something, or you two making decisions for me, but as a family figuring out what the next chapter looks like. Marcus turned back from the window. And I think I need to have regular conversations with both of you about how things are going, instead of making assumptions based on glimpses and fragments. What about the financial concerns you raised? I asked Marcus directly. Because even though your approach was hurtful, if you have legitimate questions about Dad's accounts or expenses, we should address those too. Dad reached for the notebook on his side table, the one where I tracked his appointments and medications. Actually, there's something else we need to discuss, and it relates to both the money concerns and the assisted living question. He paused, and I could see him gathering his thoughts carefully. The truth is, my memory problems are progressing faster than I've been letting on to either of you. The silence that followed Dad's admission felt dense and suffocating, like the air before a thunderstorm. I watched his weathered hands shake slightly as he closed the notebook, and suddenly all the small signs I'd been attributing to normal aging took on a more ominous weight. The repeated questions about appointments I'd answered just minutes before. The way he'd started checking the locks on doors multiple times each evening. The confusion in his eyes when I'd rearrange his pill organizer according to the system we'd used for months. Marcus sank back into his chair, his face cycling through what looked like guilt, fear, and regret. Dad, what do you mean by progressing faster? What exactly has been happening? The living room suddenly felt smaller, more cramped than it had moments before. The afternoon light streaming through the windows seemed harsh rather than warm, illuminating the dust motes floating between us like tiny reminders of all the details we'd been missing or ignoring. Well, Dad said, his voice steady but quieter than usual. Last week I got lost driving home from the grocery store. Not confused about a new route, but genuinely lost on streets I've driven for 25 years. I sat in the parking lot of that strip mall near the hardware store for almost an hour before the way home came back to me. My stomach dropped. That explained the afternoon when he'd returned from errands later than expected, looking shaken and refusing to discuss why the milk he'd gone to buy was still sitting forgotten in his car hours later. There's more, Dad continued, and I could see the effort it was taking him to maintain his composure. Sometimes I'll be in the middle of a conversation with one of you, and suddenly, I can't remember what we were talking about. Not just losing my train of thought, but having no memory that we were even speaking. And yesterday, I spent 10 minutes looking for my coffee cup while I was holding it. Marcus leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. Why didn't you tell us sooner? Because I was scared, Dad answered simply. And because I could see how much stress this whole situation was already putting on both of you. The last thing I wanted was to add more weight to what you're already carrying. I felt something crack open in my chest, a mixture of love and frustration and protective fury that had nowhere to direct itself. Dad, that's exactly the kind of thing we need to know. We can't help you if we don't understand what's really happening. The house seemed to settle around us with small creaks and sighs, as if it too was adjusting to this new reality we were confronting together. I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the same reliable appliance that had been background noise to thousands of family conversations over the years. I know that now, Dad said. And I think that's part of why I've been so resistant to changes like moving or having more help. Some part of me thought that if I could just maintain the routine, keep everything looking normal on the surface, maybe the problems would stay manageable. Marcus raised his head from his hands, his eyes red-rimmed. Is that why you were so receptive when I started asking questions about the finances and suggesting that maybe someone was taking advantage of you? Because it felt like a more manageable problem than what was really happening? The question hung in the air, and I could see Dad considering it carefully. Maybe. If the problem was external, something we could identify and fix, then it wasn't about my mind changing in ways I couldn't control. I understood then how my increased involvement in Dad's daily life, meant to be helpful and supportive, might have felt to him like evidence of his growing limitations. Every bill I took over, every appointment I scheduled, every reminder I provided was also a marker of his independence slipping away. So when Marcus suggested that my help might have ulterior motives, it gave you a way to push back against feeling dependent, I said, the pieces clicking into place. It wasn't really about not trusting me. No, it was never about not trusting you, Dad confirmed. But it was easier to imagine that the problem was your overreach rather than my increasing need for that help. Marcus stood up abruptly and began pacing the small space between the couch and Dad's chair, his movement restless and agitated. I can't believe I made everything so much worse. Instead of having honest conversations about what kind of support you needed, I created this whole conspiracy theory that added stress and division to an already difficult situation. The guilt in Marcus's voice was palpable, and I could see him spiraling into self-recrimination. But what struck me was how this revelation recontextualized everything that had happened over the past few months. The tensions and misunderstandings hadn't been about money or trust in the ways we'd thought they were. What I don't understand, I said slowly, is how we got so far away from being able to talk to each other about hard things. We used to be better at this as a family. Dad was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between Marcus and me. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of careful consideration. I think we each started protecting each other from things we thought were too difficult to share. And somewhere along the way, we forgot that families are supposed to carry difficult things together. The truth of that observation settled over us like a heavy blanket. I could trace the path of how we'd arrived here. Small kindnesses and protective omissions that had accumulated over time into significant barriers to real communication. Dad, I said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. How much time do you think we have before the memory problems make it unsafe for you to live alone? The directness of the question seemed to surprise all of us, but it felt like the crucial thing we needed to establish in order to make any real plans. Dad's answer, when it came, changed everything. Dad was quiet for so long that I began to wonder if he'd forgotten the question. But when he finally spoke, his voice was steady and clear. 6 months, maybe a year if I'm lucky, he said. The episodes are getting more frequent, and they're lasting longer. Last week I forgot where I was for almost 3 hours. I was sitting in my own living room, but nothing looked familiar. The admission hit like a physical blow. Marcus stopped pacing and sank back onto the couch, his face pale. "Dad, why didn't you tell us it was that serious?" I asked, though even as the words left my mouth, I realized how naive they sounded, given everything we'd just discussed about our family's tendency to protect each other from difficult truths. Because once I said it out loud, it would become real in a way it hasn't been yet, Dad said simply. And because I knew it would change how you both look at me, talk to me, treat me. I've been watching that shift happen gradually, and I wasn't ready to accelerate it. Jenny, who had been listening quietly from her spot on the couch, leaned forward. But keeping it to yourself meant you were carrying all that fear and uncertainty alone. That's a terrible burden. It is, Dad agreed. And I think that's part of why Marcus's suggestions about your motives felt so compelling at first. When you're already feeling vulnerable and scared, it's easier to believe that the people trying to help might have other reasons for doing so. I felt a surge of protectiveness mixed with profound sadness. Dad, I need you to know that whether you have 6 months or 6 years, my priority is making sure you feel safe and respected, and that you have as much control over your life as possible. Marcus rubbed his hands over his face. God, I feel like such an idiot. Here you were trying to figure out how to handle one of the scariest situations a person can face, and I was creating paranoid fantasies about financial conspiracies? You weren't entirely wrong, though, Dad said, surprising us both. I mean, about my finances needing attention. I've been making mistakes, small ones mostly, but they're adding up. I paid the electric bill 3 times last month because I kept forgetting I'd already sent the check. The practical implications of what Dad was telling us began to crystallize in my mind. This wasn't just about emotional support or helping with occasional tasks. This was about developing a comprehensive plan for a progressive condition that would fundamentally alter our family structure. We need to talk about what the next few months are going to look like, I said. And we need to make decisions while you're still able to be fully involved in making them. Dad nodded. I've been thinking about that too. I want to stay in this house as long as it's safe. But I also don't want to put either of you in the position of having to make emergency decisions, because I waited too long to face reality. Jenny stood up and moved to the window, looking out at Dad's small backyard garden. What would make it feel safer for you to stay here longer? What kind of support would you need? It was the right question, framed in a way that honored Dad's autonomy while acknowledging the practical challenges ahead. I could see Dad considering it seriously. Someone checking in daily, probably. Help managing bills and appointments. Eventually, maybe someone staying over some nights when the confusion gets worse. He paused. And I'd need to know that when it becomes too much, we have a plan for what comes next. I can do the daily check-ins, I said immediately. And we should probably set up a system where all your bills go through me, or get set up on automatic payments. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. I want to help too, but I clearly need to work on being more supportive and less paranoid about everyone's motives. We all need to work on communicating better, Dad said firmly. This situation is only going to get more challenging, and if we can't talk honestly about what's happening, we're going to find ourselves in crisis mode constantly. Jenny turned from the window. What about starting with weekly family meetings? A regular time when you can all check in about how things are going? What's working? What needs to change? It was a simple suggestion, but it addressed something fundamental that had been missing from our recent interactions. Intentional, scheduled time to discuss difficult topics before they became urgent problems. I like that idea, I said. It would help us stay proactive instead of always being reactive. Dad was nodding too. And it would give me a way to talk about what I'm experiencing without having to bring it up in the moment when I'm already feeling confused or scared. Marcus looked between Dad and me. Would Sunday afternoons work? I could come over after lunch, and we could make it a regular thing? That sounds perfect, Dad said. But I have one condition. We have to promise each other that we'll be honest about the hard stuff, even when it's scary or uncomfortable. The weight of that commitment settled over all of us. It meant acknowledging that the conversations ahead would be difficult, that Dad's condition would continue to deteriorate, and that our family dynamics would need to keep evolving to meet new challenges. I promise, I said, and Marcus echoed the commitment. But as we sat there making plans for a more open and communicative approach to Dad's care, none of us realized that the biggest test of our newfound honesty was already underway. Dad's condition was progressing faster than any of us understood, and the phone call that would change everything was about to happen. The morning light filtering through Dad's kitchen window seemed different somehow, softer and more fragile than it had just 3 days ago when we'd made our promises about honesty and communication. I was sitting at his familiar oak table, the same one where Marcus and I had eaten countless bowls of cereal as kids, watching Dad struggle with something as simple as his medication organizer. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to match the pills to the compartments, and I could see the frustration building in the set of his shoulders. This was exactly the kind of moment our new family meetings were supposed to help us navigate, but our first scheduled Sunday discussion was still 4 days away. Dad, do you want me to help with that? I asked gently, trying to strike the balance between offering support and maintaining his dignity. He looked up at me with eyes that held a confusion I'd never seen before, not even during our recent family crisis. I can't remember if I took my morning pills or if I'm trying to set up tonight's doses, he admitted, his voice carrying a vulnerability that made my chest tighten. Everything looks the same, but I know it should be different somehow. The pill organizer was clearly labeled with days of the week and times of day, but I could see that the letters might as well have been in a foreign language for all the sense they were making to him in this moment. This wasn't the mild forgetfulness we'd been managing. This was something more significant, more immediate than any of us had prepared for. Let's figure it out together, I said, moving my chair closer to his. Can you tell me what you remember about this morning? Did you have breakfast? Dad's brow furrowed with concentration, and I watched him mentally reach for memories that seemed to slip away as soon as he grasped for them. I think so. There's a coffee cup in the sink, so I must have had coffee. But I can't picture eating anything, and I can't picture not eating anything either. The front door opened with the familiar squeak that Dad had been meaning to fix for months, and I heard Marcus's voice calling out his usual greeting. Morning, Dad. Sarah, your car is in the driveway, so I figured you were here early. When Marcus rounded the corner into the kitchen, I saw his expression shift immediately as he took in the scene. Dad was still staring at the pill organizer with an intensity that spoke of deep confusion, and I was leaning forward with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for crisis situations. What's going on? Marcus asked, and I was grateful to hear genuine concern rather than suspicion in his voice. Dad's having trouble with his medication schedule, I explained. He's not sure if he's taken his morning doses or if he's trying to organize his evening pills. Marcus pulled out the third chair and sat down with us, studying Dad's face with the same worried attention I'd been giving to the situation. Dad, what does your stomach feel like? You usually take your blood pressure medication with food. It was a good practical question, the kind of problem-solving approach that showed Marcus was genuinely trying to help, rather than looking for reasons to be suspicious of my motives. Dad considered it seriously, pressing his hand to his stomach. Empty, he said after a moment. Definitely empty, so maybe I haven't had breakfast yet, which would mean I haven't taken the morning pills. I opened the pill organizer and saw that Wednesday morning's compartment was indeed full. Okay, so let's start with breakfast, and then you can take your morning medications. But as I moved toward the refrigerator, Dad's voice stopped me. Sarah, I need to tell you both something, and I need to say it while my head is clear enough to get the words out right. Marcus and I exchanged glances. There was something in Dad's tone that commanded attention, a gravity that made the kitchen feel suddenly smaller and more significant. I'm scared, Dad continued, his hands now folded carefully in front of him on the table. What just happened with the pills, that's been happening more often. Yesterday, I couldn't remember how to work the television remote. The day before that, I got confused about which door leads to the basement and which one leads to the bathroom. The weight of his words settled over us like a heavy blanket. These weren't the occasional memory lapses we'd been attributing to normal aging or stress. These were fundamental confusions about his daily environment and routine tasks. Why didn't you call one of us? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Because I was hoping it would get better, and because I was afraid that if I admitted how bad it's getting, you'd both decide I can't live here anymore. Dad's honesty was exactly what he'd promised us just days ago, but hearing it was more difficult than any of us had anticipated. Marcus reached across the table and covered Dad's hand with his own. Dad, we're not going to make decisions about your living situation without you. That's exactly why we set up these family meetings, so we could talk about changes as they happen, instead of waiting until there's a crisis. But this feels like a crisis, Dad said quietly. When I can't remember if I've taken medication that keeps my blood pressure stable, when I can't figure out how to change the channel on a television I've had for 3 years, that feels like the kind of thing that requires immediate action. I sat back down and looked at both of them, these two men who meant everything to me, trying to navigate a situation that none of us had enough experience to handle perfectly. Maybe we need to move up our timeline for some of the support systems we talked about. What do you mean? Marcus asked. The daily check-ins, for one thing. And maybe we need to simplify some of Dad's daily routines so they're easier to manage when he's having confused moments. I looked at Dad directly. What would feel most helpful to you right now? Dad considered the question carefully, and I could see him trying to balance his desire for independence with his practical need for support. I think I need someone to help me organize my medications for the week and maybe check that I'm taking them correctly each day. And I think I need to admit that I shouldn't be driving when I'm having bad days. The driving issue was one we hadn't even begun to address, but Dad was right to bring it up. If he was getting confused about basic household navigation, operating a vehicle safely was clearly a concern. I can come by every morning before work, I offered. It would actually be nice to start my day with coffee here instead of rushing around my own kitchen. And I can take over driving duty for appointments and errands, Marcus added. My schedule is flexible enough to handle that. Dad nodded, but I could see there was something else on his mind. There's one more thing. I need you both to promise me that you'll tell me the truth about how I'm doing, even when the truth is scary. I can handle knowing that I'm getting worse, but I can't handle feeling like I can't trust my own perceptions and also can't trust what you're telling me. It was a profound request, asking us to be honest about his decline while also being supportive of his emotional needs. I realized that our family's recent crisis over money and trust had actually prepared us for this moment in an unexpected way. We'd learned how to have difficult conversations, how to address fears and suspicions directly, and how to work through conflict without losing our fundamental love for each other. "I promise," I said. "But I also want you to promise that you'll tell us when you're scared or confused, even if you think it might change your living situation. We can't make good decisions if we don't have accurate information." Marcus nodded his agreement. "And we all need to accept that this is going to keep changing. What works this week might not work next month, and we'll have to keep adapting." Dad smiled for the first time that morning, a real smile that reached his eyes despite the serious nature of our conversation. "You know, a week ago, I was worried that you two couldn't get along well enough to help me with anything. Now I'm realizing that you've both grown into adults who can handle complicated situations with more grace than I expected." The irony wasn't lost on any of us. The crisis that had brought us together had ultimately prepared us for a much larger challenge, one that would require all the communication skills and mutual trust we'd been forced to develop. Marcus stood up and moved toward the coffee maker. "How about we start this new routine right now? I'll make fresh coffee, Sarah can help you sort out breakfast and medications, and we can spend the morning figuring out what other adjustments might make your daily routine easier." As we settled into this new dynamic, I realized that our family had learned something valuable about facing difficult situations together. We'd discovered that honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, creates a foundation for solving problems rather than avoiding them. The trust we'd rebuilt after Marcus's accusations about money was now serving us as we navigated Dad's changing needs. Over the next hour, we established a simple system for Dad's daily medications, programmed important phone numbers into speed dial settings on his phone, and created a basic daily routine that would provide structure during confusing moments. More importantly, we demonstrated to ourselves that we could work together effectively. Combining Marcus's practical problem-solving skills with my organizational abilities and Dad's insight into his own needs. The morning had started with confusion and fear, but it ended with a plan and a renewed sense of family unity. We'd learned to face difficulties head-on rather than letting them fester in silence, and that skill would serve us well in the months ahead. If your family is dealing with aging parents or difficult conversations about changing abilities, don't wait for a crisis to start talking honestly about what's happening. Those uncomfortable discussions might actually bring you closer together and prepare you to handle whatever challenges come next.